If you love clean and simple cards with a little wow factor, you're going to love these Aperture cards. I'm sharing designs that look polished, dimensional, and clean from every angle, and you can use these designs for both masculine and feminine cards just by changing up the colors. They're surprisingly easy to create, so let's dive in. The first card is a masculine design, and I'm starting with this 5x7 light gray card base I made with Spellbinder's Fog cardstock. I'll start by creating the stamped background with Misty Coast from Pinkfresh Studio and Water Hyacinth from Altenew. I'll also throw in some Indigo Skies accents later. I'll build the background stripe by stripe since these are individual stems, and the grid lines on the Misty are a great guide for keeping the stripe straight. I can already see the ink behaving a little unevenly, so I'll likely need to stamp a few times to build up even coverage. I recently purchased quite a few products from the Concord and 9th April 2026 release, and these are all designed by Christina Warner, and I'll list all the supplies and card measurements in my blog post, which will be linked in the video description if you're interested. Once I'm happy, I'll rotate the cardstock and repeat the stamping to cover the other end. I'll repeat the process with the thinner stripe now, and again I'm using the grid lines for guidance. Because the design is so linear, even a small shift would show. Again, I'll flip the card around and stamp the other end. The stamping is done, and now it's time to create the sentiment label before I create the aperture. I'm using one of these Pinkfresh Studio dies. I love the diagonal etchings on the border, and this will be the perfect size for the sentiment panel. I'll heat emboss the sentiment in white. The sentiment reads, "Hope today treats you gently and tomorrow feels even brighter." And that could work beautifully as a get well card or really any encouragement cards. I should have used a larger piece of cardstock, heat embossed it first and then cut it down to size, but I didn't want to waste the blue cardstock, so now I have to struggle to position the sentiment properly. If you're calling me stingy right now, you won't be wrong. I'll test alignment on acetate first to ensure everything is straight before committing. And that does look straight, so I can go ahead and stamp on the cardstock with confidence. The white pigment ink I used to stamp stays wet long enough to hold the embossing powder nicely. I'm using Altenew Pure White embossing powder because it gives a crisp, clean finish. I'll run my heat tool for a few seconds before embossing because that reduces the time it takes to melt the powder and dramatically reduces the chances of the cardstock warping, especially since there's so much to melt. I'll let it cool for a moment before cleaning up the white anti-static powder and restoring the beautiful navy color. I like to start with the Swiffer to remove some of the powder, and then I'll use this fine-tipped eraser, which is actually electric, but I use it in manual mode for more control in really tight areas. I'm being very light with the eraser and avoiding the embossed areas as much as possible. And you'll see the color being restored beautifully. Takes a little bit of patience, but it's so worth it. I've heard other crafters wiping it down lightly with alcohol, but this feels more comfortable for me. Plus, it's therapeutic to work with the eraser. Does anyone else feel this way? I don't know, but sometimes I think repetitive work is quite calming. The embossing has become a little dull, but one of my viewers taught me a great trick to restore its gloss. I'll hit the panel again briefly with the heat tool. And there we go. The embossing melted enough for the shine to be restored. You may not see it clearly on camera, but the finish is clean and crisp now with no leftover residue. Now, this sentiment is going to go on the inside, but I still need to create the aperture on the front so you can actually see it through the card. I used this die size earlier, so now I'll go one size larger. That way, when the card is assembled, the entire sentiment inside will be visible through the opening. Maybe I'll cut the aperture slightly off to the side on the thirds. That way, even if it isn't perfectly centered, it will still work well visually. Now, I'll need to keep the card open and feed the card through the die cutting machine since I only want to cut the card front. So the best solution is to use my larger die cutting machine. If you don't have a larger machine, just wrap the card base around the plate, ensuring only the front fold of the card is on the plate. If you're creating an A2 card, it should absolutely fit through your die cutting machine when it's opened flat. This machine is quite heavy, but I find it extremely useful for larger projects like this. Now I have my aperture and I can save this piece for another project. It would make a great background or sentiment panel on another clean and simple card. This piece is going to sit right here. I'll add a bit of foam tape behind it to give it dimension. Now, I want to avoid that stark white edge of the foam tape showing from behind, so I'll color the edges with a black marker. That way, everything blends more seamlessly, and this is a great trick for creating your custom colored foam tape. Now I want to frame around the aperture. I'll use the same size die I used for the aperture, another one that's a size larger to create the frame. I'll use this magnetic sheet to hold the dies in place so they don't move while I position them. All right, now I've got my frame and we are in business. I also have another label left over that I can use on a future project. By the way, if you need multiple layers when cutting frames, remember not to pull the dies apart, as that ensures you have identical frames that stack perfectly. This frame will sit perfectly around the aperture. For adhesive, I'll use the new Gina K matte glue because this frame has slits, and even if the glue oozes out, it'll dry matte and won't be that noticeable. I just need to be careful not to apply too much regardless. And there we have our first aperture card. I could have added the dotted stripe stamp directly across the solid stripe too. And you know what? I might still do that because it does feel a little bare right now. And the card is really done this time. Here is the finished card. I really like the subtle dimension it has. When you open it, there's space to write on both the inside panels. And you can absolutely turn this into a feminine card by swapping out the ink colors. If you want to see how I did that in my next card, keep watching. So I want to use this solid stripe stamp set now for the next card. But before I do that, I want to show you what I have been experimenting with since the stripe stamps earlier gave me a bit of trouble getting a smooth and consistent impression. The ink did smooth out quite a bit on the earlier card, as you can see, and looks really good now. So I wanted to test different inks and cardstock and see if the results varied. I tried both dye inks and distress oxides on both smoother and slightly textured cardstock. For cardstock, this one is Spellbinder's Fairy Tale, which is a very soft pale lavender, but does have a very light texture to it. And for this version, I used Pink Fresh inks in Opulence and Wisteria with Altenew Amethyst as the midtone. And even though the ink did smooth out a little bit later, you can still see a lot of texture in the stamped lines. Then I tried Distress Oxides on smoother paper to see if that made a difference. For this one, I stamped directly onto the cardstock first. And for this version, I actually brushed the ink onto the stamp instead of inking it directly. That did give a slightly smoother result. You can still see that the ink isn't completely even on smoother paper. So I tested multiple approaches to rule out paper issues. The Spellbinder's cardstock is smooth, but not as smooth as Nina or Hammermill. This one here is Hammermill 80 pound, which is very smooth. I wanted to show you the techniques I was testing in case you were considering purchasing this set. I'll set that aside and instead move to Nina Classic Crest for the next card, which is a much smoother cardstock. I've already cut the window out with a word die, which I'll show you in just a bit, and now I'll just start stamping the stripes. I won't bore you with the entire stamping process and only show you highlights because I just wanted to demonstrate the technique I used on this one that got me much better results. And if you're enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. It really helps support it. I noticed that applying ink in straight brush strokes gives much better results than dabbing. So I'll continue with one stripe at a time, and actually the Nina cardstock is performing much better here. I think the paper played a huge role in the uneven results earlier. This looks better, but I'm still seeing some splotches, so I'll just add some ink directly to the stripe, but in hindsight, that wasn't quite smart. But I expect that to smooth out once it dries, so I'll leave it as it is. I'll continue with the stamping in exactly the same way with the straight brush strokes, and I'll be right back. Well, it took me a good 15 minutes to complete the stamping, and I let the panel dry for about 30 minutes. I also added a stamped sub-sentiment from the same stamp set. It adds a nice little detail to balance the design. Now I'll start assembling the card. I'll adhere the sentiment first so I don't lose placement, and for that I'll position the front panel with some tape runner so the panel doesn't shift while I adhere the sentiment die cut. This glue dries matte, which is perfect for clean finishes. I'll add a small yarn detail to the back and secure it with a bit of tape so it doesn't move. Now I'll add foam tape underneath the main panel to create depth. I want the sentiment to feel slightly recessed, so I think I'll add one more layer of foam tape for more dimension. That should give it a nice shadow effect. And I think that's it. I added some gems for finishing touches, and here is the finished card. I think it turned out really pretty with soft dimension and a clean layered look. You see how changing the color palette completely changes the feel of the card? For this next card, I'll start with stenciling. I'm using my $2 AliExpress mat since this panel is too large for my Altenew sticky mat, which is what I normally use. I've already prepared a 5.5 by 5.5 inch square card base that's waiting in the wings for me to debut, but I'll start with this larger panel to work with the 6x9 stencil set. This size will be perfect for the design, and I'll have a leftover piece for another project. Finally, for the stems and leaves, I'll use a soft gray rather than the traditional green. I'll apply it lightly at first to keep things soft, but I'll do a second blend for a bit more depth near the bases of the stems and leaves. And wow, look at that. I absolutely love how this turned out. You can try different color palettes to change up the mood of this card, of course, but I wanted something really soft and muted in keeping with the sentiment. Next, I'll use a die to cut out my panel so it gives me that beautiful finished edge. I have my card panel, and the best part is I can actually save the leftover piece and turn it into a gift tag or another small project. I'll have a narrow border around the panel, which is really nice. Next, I'll cut out the aperture, which I could do in 2 steps by cutting out the stencil panel and then the card base, but I really like to be efficient and minimize my effort when I can, so I'll do it in one pass. This inner piece will sit within the frame on the card base. I'll secure the floral panel with glue and then place the square piece back in position. Alright, that's looking good. So now the next step is adding the acetate layer. I'm using heat resistant acetate from Salmon Says Stamp because I'll be heat embossing the sentiment on it. I'll keep the backing paper on for now, measure carefully, and then mark where I need to cut. I'll trim it down, but my guillotine is rebelling today, so I'll just go the good old-fashioned way and use my scissors. I was going to adhere the acetate, but I'll have to pause here because I just realized I need to complete the heat embossing first. Placing a white sheet beneath the acetate in my MISTI helps a lot. Wow, that sticky mat looks disgusting. I'll have to remember to clean it sometime. I'll apply anti-static powder generously to the acetate before stamping. I'm using the square sentiment from the Concord and Ninth Bold Stripes Greeting stamp set. Actually, I haven't used many Concord and Ninth products in the past, and this is the first time I'm using products designed by Christina Warner. I'm loving the collection so far, has a lot of possibilities, especially for masculine cards, which you saw earlier. Since acetate is really staticky, it's clinging on to a lot of stray embossing powder, so I'll need to give it a good cleaning before I take my heat tool to it. I'll use my Swiffer to clean it up a bit. I'll run the heat tool for a few seconds to get it nice and hot so I don't expose the acetate to the heat longer than necessary. Even though I'm using heat-resistant acetate, it's not completely immune to prolonged heating, as you'll soon see. It did warp a little bit, but definitely not as much as regular acetate would. Also, I like to melt the embossing powder from the back to get a smoother finish. Now, I'll let this cool for a couple of minutes and wipe away the anti-static powder with a little rubbing alcohol. Since the alcohol took away a bit of the shine from the embossing, I'll just give it one more quick zap with the heat tool. Perfect, the shine is back. Time to adhere the acetate. Now I could finish the card right here and it would be beautiful, but I'll take it one step further and add a frame on the reverse side since the glue looks ugly through the acetate. I'm using the same square die I used to cut the aperture and another square die that's 2 sizes larger, so I can cut out a wide-ish frame to disguise the acetate. Now this frame will sit right behind the window and disguise all the acetate edges and give everything a polished finish. I'll apply glue carefully, keeping it away from the inner edges so nothing oozes out onto the acetate. I can see a tiny sliver of acetate on one side, so maybe I can cut another larger frame later and use that to hide it. Finally, I'll use a couple of fine frames to finish the card. I'm using a white frame for the inside. There's a risk it might peek through the front if it isn't adhered perfectly straight. Even a tiny shift would be noticeable from the inside. I apologize, I didn't realize I was partially out of the frame here. I'll just use a clean piece of non-stick sheet to press everything down and avoid the excess glue from getting all over the card. Before I move on to the card front, I'll layer up the foil frame with the white one. I'll use the negative die cut to line up the frames since these are very delicate. I'm just adding small dots of glue, very controlled, very minimal. The aperture was cut using a different die set, so it won't match perfectly, but it's pretty close. So I'll just adjust it slightly and keep everything aligned. Finally, I'll wipe down the acetate with some rubbing alcohol since there's embossing residue and fingerprints on it. I think a Q-tip will offer more precision, especially around the stamped area. And here is the finished card. Honestly, it was a little involved, but I think it turned out beautifully. I really love how the acetate layer floats on the card front with the heat embossed sentiment. It gives such a soft, elegant effect. And the soft floral panel is absolutely stunning. The back can be used as writing space. The stenciling turned out so pretty, and you could even fussy cut these flowers individually if you wanted to. Just selectively color and cut them out. I have a bonus card to inspire you a little more, so keep watching. I created this last card off camera because it was more of a trial piece where I was experimenting with a different technique and I didn't want to make this video even longer. Since the stamp is quite solid like the stripes, I wanted to apply distress oxides directly onto the stamp using a brayer this time. The stamp is also part of the collection I purchased and it's really pretty, so I wanted to try out gel plate and vellum techniques with it. I tried a few different approaches and honestly, I'm really liking the results from this experiment. I used 2 blue distress oxide inks and I love the blended effect it created. I think this would make such a beautiful background technique as well. For this card, I used a vellum panel in the aperture. I stamped on one side, but then I flipped it over and used the reverse side on the card front because the effect was a little softer and more subdued. Plus, it doesn't give me a weird chalky feel on the card front. Then I used the thin frame dies again to create the frames. And this one here was created from the printed vellum scrap. This is also how I attached the vellum piece. I finished the card with a sentiment from the Bold Stripes collection and added a few gems to complete it. I'll leave you with some still photos of the finished cards, and I hope you enjoy seeing them. Again, if you enjoyed this video and you haven't already, please give it a like and do subscribe. It really helps support my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.